In old times on the Mississippi, Samuel Clemens writes about becoming a steamboat pilot. The critical aptitude, safely navigating a changing river. Now to pull this off, you need to constantly check on your depth. And Mark Twain was called out to indicate there were 2 fathoms of water under the boat. But Twain says he took the name from a riverboat captain. And the Atlantic speculates that he stole it from a humor journal so lame that he quickly invented a cooler story to pass it off as true. What's the true story? It doesn't matter. And that's the point. Most applicants make the mistake of thinking they have to reach the right answer. But in college admission writing, it's all about showing your work. It's not important if I conclude the Atlantic's evidence is weak and I trust Twain, or the Atlantic's evidence is strong and they caught Mark in a whopper. I score points in grappling with this debate because it shows you that I'm intellectually curious, that I have IV, that I've taken the time to explore an issue I find interesting. But I know that it's unhelpful to tell you, hey, write something smart and interesting. So I put together 10 moves for how to take any topic and write about it in a smart and interesting way. You can use these moves in any of your writing, from a paragraph in your personal essay to a short 250-word supplemental essay, all the way down to a 50-word popcorn question. Notice that we're not calling these hacks or tricks, we're calling them moves, like the moves a chess player makes. And just like the expert chess player, you need to practice them. Otherwise, they will look like gimmicks instead of the deep intellectual moves that they really are. And the way you practice is by writing and rewriting and seeing what works. These moves aren't designed to make you sound smart, because each move requires you to do work, to look something up, to think hard and find a connection, to create something new. And that's why you get credit for them. They prove to a skeptical admission reader that you don't just sound smart, you are smart. Move 1, origin. Here's the move. Discuss the origin of anything you find interesting or important. Origin is one of the best ways to show IV, because only an intellectually curious person takes the time to investigate where something comes from. Let's check it out in action. Let's say you're interested in the phrase lost generation. Here's what a competitive applicant writes. I'm fascinated by the way wars affect different generations. World War I produced the lost generation. World War II produced the greatest generation. How does a whole generation of citizens get cast aside as lost or lionized as greatest? I'd love to dig into these questions as a history major. Not bad. There's IV there. It's a nice connection, a fine way to show a budding historian in the making. But this response just begs the question, where do these names come from? This author failed to run the extra lap after practice. It's not a hard lap. You want to be compelling? Let's run it. Go to the origin. Here's what a compelling applicant writes. The story goes that Gertrude Stein dubbed the boys who fought in France the lost generation, but that's not quite true. She's to blame, but she's not the source. The real poet who damned a generation was a Parisian garage owner. He flung the condemnation, "You are all a lost generation," at a young mechanic after Stein huffed and puffed about not having the ignition on her Model T fixed fast enough. Historians live on primary sources and treat literature as dessert, but we only know this because Hemingway told us so in Movable Feast. Now you're on a different level because you're doing history. And you can do this. All it takes is doing some research into the origin story of anything. Watch, it doesn't have to be something IV like Lost Generation. You can do it with fun topics too. And I'm going to prove it to you by picking 2 bizarre topics that couldn't be more different. First, spam. Then, the bikini. Let's say you have an obsession with spam. I've actually never had it. But watch how we can intellectualize spam just by tracing its origin. At a New Year's Eve party at our house, a fellow felt sufficiently inspired. As if it was nothing at all, he said, "Spam." I knew then and there that the name was perfect. That's Jay Hormel, inventor of my favorite comestible, back in August '45. How Hormel pulled off this everlasting elixir of pork shoulder and ham in a can is still a miracle. Spam hit shelves in 1937. Now look, you can do all sorts of things with that paragraph, right? If you're into marketing, you launch into a discussion of Hormel's thought process for coming up with the name. It needed to be short, different, pronounceable, etc. If you're into chemistry, how did Hormel solve the riddle of non-perishable pork? If you're into history, you march into World War II and Hormel's discussion of this scurrilous file where he dumps all of his letters of abuse that are sent to him by soldiers everywhere in the world. Now, guess where all that material comes from? The New Yorker archives. A simple search for spam and voila, Spam Man. Brendan Gill, 1945. So don't sleep on class 6. Okay, here's another fun example. Let's say you're at the beach and you're wondering about the story behind the bikini. You can intellectualize that topic. Just go to the origin. A bikini isn't a bikini unless it can, quote, be pulled through a wedding ring. That's Louis Réat on his French invention. Who else did you think came up with it? Less than 2 years after the liberation of Paris, the avant-garde French designer named the bikini in a bizarre bit of association after the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, where the US had announced the successful testing of atomic weapons. Again, you can go all sorts of directions with this, right? If you're into feminism, liberation or objectification? If you're into theology, let me hear you start talking about the Garden of Eden. You're into sociology. The magnets in that paragraph are just waiting to connect with the 1960s, California, the Beach Boys. Again, where do you find this material? We mentioned it in class 6, Writer's Almanac. But Google, of course, serves you well. I mean, run a search and you'll return excellent sources on the origin of the bikini, from the Washington Post to history.com. The Met has an online exhibition, but don't sleep on class 6. Do research.